For 50 years he carried a poison in his blood and a silence in his heart. Robert "Rob" Callahan came home from the Vietnam War with more than scars. The invisible rain of Agent Orange had settled into his body, poisoning his lungs, his liver, and the years that followed. But the deepest wound was one no doctor could see 20 years without speaking to his only son. Now, with his health failing and time slipping away, Rob faces a choice he's avoided for half a century: confront the past or leave it buried forever. This is the story of a winter journey, a fragile seed planted in the snow, and a father's final act of courage. The wind moved slowly over the ridge, carrying the crisp scent of late autumn through the thin walls of the old cabin. Robert, Rob Callahan, sat in the wooden chair by the window, his body folded into itself, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that had long since gone cold. Beyond the glass, the forest was aflame with color rust-red amber, and that particular shade of orange that seemed to belong to both beauty and warning. Those leaves had been falling for days, collecting in uneven drifts along the gravel path that led to his porch. Each gust of wind sent them scattering like fragments of a memory that refused to stay buried. Rob watched them without blinking, his breath fogging the glass in slow, measured bursts. His lungs worked harder these days, every inhale like dragging air through a thin straw. The doctor had a name for it: chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, but Rob preferred to think of it as the war never letting go. On the small table beside him sat a wooden box. Its surface was scratched, the varnish worn thin where his fingers had traced the grain countless times. Inside, nestled in a faded piece of cloth, was a single maple seed. He had carried it back from a place far away and long ago, back when his hands were steady and his steps were sure. For 50 years he had never planted it. He told himself it was because the soil here was too stubborn, the winters too long. But the truth, though he rarely let himself speak it, was that some things felt too sacred to risk losing. A dull ache flared in his chest as he reached for the mug, and his hand trembled just enough for the tea to slosh against the rim. The pain was familiar now, an uninvited companion. His body had been breaking down piece by piece, a slow collapse that no medicine could reverse. The war had given him many things: stories, scars, an unshakable awareness of how quickly life could be stolen. But it had also given him something invisible, something that had been carried home inside his blood: dioxin, the invisible poison from the chemical mist they called Agent Orange. The first time he saw it, he didn't know what it was. He was 21, moving through the dense green of a Vietnamese forest when the sky opened and a fine shimmering rain fell. The droplets clung to his skin, soaked his uniform. They told him it was just defoliant, meant to strip the leaves from the trees so the enemy would have nowhere to hide. He never thought it might strip something from him, too. A cough tore through him, sharp and wet. He pressed a cloth to his mouth until the spasm passed, then leaned back, eyes closed. Somewhere in the distance, a chainsaw hummed briefly before falling silent. This was the way days passed now, in fragments of sound and memory, with the steady march of decline filling the spaces in between. The phone on the counter hadn't rung in weeks. It rarely did anymore. There were people he could call: old friends from the service, a neighbor who sometimes brought groceries, but the silence felt safer. Silence didn't ask questions. Silence didn't demand that he explain why he still lived alone, why the only photograph in his living room was of a boy with dark hair and a guarded smile. Michael. He whispered the name under his breath as though it might lose its weight if spoken too loudly. His son, his only child. The last time they had spoken, the words had been hard, sharp-edged. Michael had been 18 then, already carrying the burden of a heart that didn't work right. Rob had been in and out of hospitals himself, always with another test, another treatment. Somewhere between the sicknesses, the distance had grown. And then came the night when Michael had said, "You gave this to me," and Rob had no answer because in the hollow place of his chest he feared it might be true. A shaft of pale sunlight broke through the clouds, catching on the rim of the maple seed's wing inside the box. Rob reached for it, holding it gently between his thumb and forefinger. Its paper-thin edge was brittle, its body small but intact. He thought about planting it. He thought about watching it grow, but he knew that if it died in the cold earth it would feel like losing something twice. His gaze drifted to the calendar pinned to the wall. A date circled in red stared back at him: last week's appointment with Dr. Keener. He hadn't gone. What was the point? Every visit ended the same way with the same words. "We can manage the symptoms, but the damage is permanent." But the call had come anyway. 2 days ago, the nurse's voice had been gentle, almost rehearsed. "Your liver is failing faster than expected, without a transplant. You may have months, not years. Months." He had been living in a kind of slow surrender for years, but hearing it spoken aloud made something shift inside him. Not fear exactly, but the awareness that time was no longer a wide-open field. It was a narrowing road, and the end was coming into view. Outside, the wind rose again, scattering another wave of orange leaves across the yard. One landed on the porch step, spinning in place before settling. He remembered Jungle's stripped bare trees standing like skeletons against the gray sky. He remembered running through fields that burned without fire. And he remembered the face of a young man named Danny, his best friend, who had stood beside him in that orange rain. Danny hadn't made it home. Rob let the seed fall back into the box and closed the lid. The light had shifted now, leaning toward evening. Shadows stretched long across the floor, and the cabin felt colder, though the stove still burned. He reached for the wool blanket draped over the chair and pulled it around his shoulders. The silence in the room was deep, but inside his head the past played on scene after scene, as if the war were a film he couldn't stop watching. Somewhere in that reel, Michael's face appeared again, older now, but with the same guarded eyes. Rob wondered where he was tonight. He wondered if his son still thought of him, or if the distance had grown so wide there was no way back. The thought pressed heavy on his chest, heavier even than the disease. And yet, a part of him knew he couldn't leave things as they were. Not if the nurse's voice was right, not if the road ahead was as short as it now seemed. The maple seed waited in the box. The leaves outside burned in their final colors, and Robert Callahan sat in the fading light, breathing slow and shallow, feeling the weight of the season in his bones. If you believe stories like this matter, if you believe in the quiet courage of lives lived after the war, stay with me for this journey. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can walk every step of it with us. The sun dipped lower, and for a moment the whole forest seemed lit from within, the orange glowing like embers in the cold. It would not last. Winter was coming. But for now, Rob kept watching, his fingers resting on the box as though holding the possibility of planting something before the snow came. The day began with the smell of rain. It drifted through the cracks in the cabin walls, mingling with the scent of wood smoke from the stove. Rob had been awake since before dawn, listening to the rhythmic patter of water on the roof, the sound breaking and rejoining in uneven waves. He sat at the kitchen table with a pen in his hand, a blank sheet of paper before him. The pen felt heavier than it should have, as though every word he hadn't written in 20 years had gathered inside it, waiting to spill out. The phone call had come the night before. The voice on the line had been brisk but kind. A nurse's voice. "Your son, Michael Callahan, was admitted this evening. Severe arrhythmia. He's stable for now, but his condition is serious. He'll need surgery soon." The words had landed like stones dropped into deep water. Rob hadn't asked how they had found his number. He hadn't asked who had given permission to call him. Instead, he had simply said thank you, his voice catching in a place he hadn't used in years. Now the paper waited in front of him. He had thought he might write a letter, something Michael could read without the tension of a phone call, without the awkward weight of an unexpected visit. But how do you begin to speak to someone who has been a ghost in your life for decades? How do you arrange the words so they don't cut? Rain tapped harder against the window. Rob bent his head and began to write. "Michael, I heard about the hospital. I don't know if you want me there. I don't know if you want anything from me, but I need you to know I never stopped caring. Not for a day. I wasn't there when I should have been, and I can't change that. I can only say I'm sorry, if you're willing. I'd like to see you before—" His pen hovered the next word forming in his mind but refusing to reach the page. Before? What? Before the surgery. Before? One of them was gone. The truth pressed at him sharp and unrelenting, but he could not bring himself to write it. A gust of wind rattled the window pane and the sound jolted something loose in him. Memory surged uninvited. Michael was 10 years old, lying in a hospital bed in Columbus. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow. Rob had been there for the first few days, sitting at his side holding his small hand in his own. Then, on the 4th morning, his own body had betrayed him breathless, dizzy, collapsing in the hallway. They'd admitted him to another ward in the same building, diagnosing him with complications from his lungs. He had sent a nurse to tell Michael he'd be back soon. But soon had stretched into days, and by the time he returned, Michael's eyes were colder, harder. The boy had turned his face away, and Rob had felt something in himself break. He set the pen down now, his hands trembling slightly. The past was a weight that never lightened. It simply shifted from one side of the body to the other. Footsteps sounded on the porch, followed by a knock. Rob wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment he stayed still, hoping whoever it was might decide no one was home. But the knock came again, firmer this time. He opened the door to find a woman in a green coat. Her cheeks flushed from the cold. She carried a canvas bag over one shoulder and a clipboard under her arm. "Mr. Callahan?" she asked, her voice bright but not intrusive. He nodded, wary. "I'm Sarah," she said. "I work with the Veterans Outreach program in town. We check in on folks now and then, make sure they've got what they need. I thought I'd stop by since I was in the area." Rob hesitated, but the rain was still falling and it felt wrong to leave her standing there. He stepped aside. Inside, she glanced around the small space, the wood stove, the stacks of old newspapers, the single photograph on the shelf. "You live here alone?" He gave a short nod. They spoke for a while, mostly about unimportant things, how long he'd been in the cabin, how the road sometimes washed out in spring. But Sarah's eyes kept drifting to the paper on the table, the half-written letter with its uneven lines. Finally, she asked, "Is that for someone important?" Rob's mouth worked before he answered. "My son. That's good," she said. "It's never too late to write." But even as she said it, he felt the sharp edge of doubt. He picked up the paper again, read the words he had written, and felt the weight of their inadequacy. There was too much history to fit between margins. Too much left unsaid to ever find the right way to say it. Before Sarah left, she placed a small card on the table. "If you decide you want to ride into town, or to the hospital, let me know. I'm there every week." When the door closed behind her, the cabin felt quieter than before. Rob sat back down at the table, staring at the paper. He thought of Michael's guarded eyes, the way his voice had sounded the last time they spoke, tight, almost shaking. He thought of the accusation, "You gave this to me." The words still burned. Something in him recoiled from the vulnerability on the page. In one motion, he tore the letter in half, then into quarters. The sound of paper ripping seemed too loud in the small room. He dropped the pieces into the trash, his chest tightening. It was easier to leave things broken than to try to mend them and fail. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Rob walked to the window and saw that the leaves were plastered to the ground, their bright orange dulled to rust. He thought about how quickly color faded, how a thing could be vibrant one day and barely recognizable the next. He closed the wooden box with the maple seed inside, sliding it back onto the shelf. Not yet, he told himself. The ground wasn't ready. Maybe it never would be. But that night, long after the stove's fire had burned down to embers, he lay awake listening to the wind. And somewhere in that restless darkness the thought came again, quiet but insistent. If time is running out, what am I waiting for? If you've been following Rob's journey and you believe in the power of healing even after decades of silence, subscribe to our channel now. Stay with us as we walk the uncertain road ahead. He turned onto his side, facing the wall, the image of Michael's hospital bed refusing to leave him. In the morning, he told himself he would decide. But morning had a way of slipping away just as years had. The invitation had been sitting on the kitchen counter for weeks, a folded piece of paper printed with the emblem of the local Veterans Association. Rob had glanced at it once then pushed it aside beneath a stack of unopened mail. It was Sarah who had picked it up during her last visit, smoothing the crease with her palm and reading the words aloud. Annual Veterans Gathering. This Saturday, Lakeside Community Hall. It's just a few hours, she'd said, placing it back in front of him. You might like it, or at least you might not hate it. Now, Saturday had arrived. The morning was clear but bitterly cold frost clinging to the grass like a thin crust of glass. Rob stood on the porch, his coat zipped to his chin, the wind nudging against his ribs. He thought of turning back, of letting the day pass as so many others had. But the sound of Sarah's voice echoed in his head, and beneath it a quieter thought maybe it was time to step into a room where other people carried the same ghosts. The Lakeside Community Hall was a low wooden building with wide steps leading up to double doors. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old pine. Tables were arranged in a circle, each holding trays of sandwiches and paper cups. About 24 men and women stood in small clusters, their postures a mix of ease and hesitation. Rob recognized no one at first, but as he moved toward a corner table, a man with broad shoulders and thinning hair caught his eye. Callahan, the man asked, his face breaking into a surprised grin. Rob Callahan, from the 3rd Battalion. It took a moment for the name to fall into place. Harlan. Rob said finally. They shook hands, the grip firm but careful, as though testing the strength of old bones. Harlan looked older, but the lines around his eyes deepened the same way when he smiled. They sat together, and soon others joined, a man named Lewis, a woman named Marlene, who had been a field nurse. The talk flowed easily at first, where they'd settled, who had passed on the strange way time both stretched and collapsed when they thought back to those years. It wasn't long before the conversation turned to what they had carried home. Harlan spoke first, his voice steady but low. My boy Eric, born with spina bifida. Doctors think it's connected to the exposure. Marlene nodded. You're not alone there. I've seen too many cases. Kids born sick to men who walked through those fields. Rob listened, something loosening in his chest with every word. For decades, he had worn his guilt like a second skin, convinced Michael's condition was a personal curse, a punishment for the choices he'd made. Hearing the others speak, he realized the pattern stretched far beyond his own life. The poison had seeped into all of them, into the years that came after. The room hummed with quiet stories, missed birthdays, hospital stays, marriages strained by illness. No one needed to explain the way the past bled into the present. They all understood. At one point, Lewis leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Rob. You've got a boy, don't you? Rob hesitated, then nodded. Talk to him, Lewis said. Before the time runs out. The words landed harder than Rob expected. Time was already thinning, and not just for him. During a break, he stepped outside for air. The lake stretched out in front of the hall, its surface catching the pale winter sun. The water was still the kind of stillness that made every sound sharper, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the distant call of a bird. But somewhere beneath those natural sounds, Rob heard it, the echo of gunfire, not here but from another lifetime. He was back in the thick heat of the jungle, his boots sinking into mud. Danny was beside him, shouting something Rob couldn't hear over the whine of engines overhead. Then came the hiss, the chemical rain falling like mist. Leaves curled and blackened where it touched them. Danny's skin glistened, droplets clinging before sliding down. Rob blinked hard, forcing the image away, but the silence that followed was almost worse. When he returned inside, Sarah was there speaking with one of the coordinators. She caught his eye and walked over. I wasn't sure you'd actually come, she said. Wasn't sure myself, he admitted. I'm glad you did. There's something else you should know. Her tone shifted, and Rob felt the air tighten around them. I stopped by the hospital yesterday, Sarah continued. Michael's condition is more serious than they thought. They've scheduled surgery for next Friday. It's risky, Rob. They wanted to be sure you knew. The floor seemed to tilt beneath him. Friday was less than a week away. He thought of the phone call, the letter he'd torn to pieces. He thought of Michael lying in a hospital bed, heart struggling, time narrowing. Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "You can still get there. If you want, I'll drive you." He opened his mouth, but no words came. The noise of the hall pressed in the clink of cups, the low hum of conversation. Yet none of it reached him fully. All he could hear was the relentless ticking of a clock he could not see. When the gathering ended, he left with the others, the cold air biting at his face. The path to the parking lot was lined with bare trees, their branches thin against the sky. He imagined what they would look like in spring, heavy with green, the air warm again. But spring felt far away, and next Friday was closing in fast. That night, back at the cabin, he lit the stove and sat by the window. The maple seed rested in its box, the wing catching the firelight. He thought of planting it now in frozen ground just to see if it could survive. But instead, he closed the lid and kept it near. The wind picked up, rattling the eaves. Somewhere in that sound he thought he heard it again, the distant crack of gunfire, a reminder that the past was never as far away as it seemed. If you've walked this far into Rob's story, don't let go now. Subscribe to our channel and stay with us for what comes next, because some roads can only be traveled together. The orange leaves were gone now, swept away by winter winds. What remained was the bare truth, standing stark against the cold. There was no more time to wait. The first snow came in the night, soft and unannounced. Rob woke to the pale glow of morning, pressing through the curtains, the silence outside so complete it felt as if the world had been wrapped in cotton. He stepped to the window and saw it, white stretching unbroken across the yard. The gravel path vanished, the forest now a frozen mural. The maple seed lay in its box on the table as it always did. But something about the snow, about the clean sweep of it over the land, made him think of endings and beginnings. It had been 3 days since Sarah told him about the surgery. 4 days until Friday. The decision had been circling in him like a hawk in the winter sky. Now in the stillness it came to rest. He would go. It wasn't a matter of forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever. But if there was a chance to stand at his son's side before the knife and the anesthesia, to let his presence speak the words he could not find, he would take it. He pulled his old army coat from the closet, the fabric stiff at the seams. The weight of it was familiar, as if it remembered the shape of his shoulders. He packed a small canvas bag, a change of clothes, a thermos of coffee, the maple seed wrapped in cloth. By mid-morning, the snow was still falling light but steady. Rob started the truck, its engine coughing twice before catching. The tires crunched over the hidden road, each turn slow, deliberate. The landscape rolled past in muted colors. Gray sky, white fields, dark skeletal trees. The farther he drove, the more the road narrowed. Snow gathering in wind-carved drifts. He gripped the wheel tighter, his breath fogging the cab. The heater rattled, blowing air that was warm in bursts and cold in between. Halfway to the main highway, the truck began to labor against the incline of a hill. The tires spun, whining, until finally the vehicle shuddered to a halt. Rob sat there, the engine idling, the snow whispering against the windshield. He thought about turning back, but the image of Michael lying in a hospital bed rose up clear and undeniable. Rob shut off the engine, pulled the bag over his shoulder, and stepped into the snow. The cold bit into him, instantly settling in his bones. The road ahead wound through a stand of pines, their branches heavy under the weight of ice. His boots sank deep, each step an effort. The rhythm of his breath grew ragged, his chest tightening with every incline. He passed an old fence half buried in snow, and remembered another road in another country, the air thick with humidity instead of frost, the ground giving underfoot for entirely different reasons. In that place, every step had been a risk, every shadow a possible threat. Here, the enemy was time. A mile and his legs began to shake. The thermos banged lightly against his side, with each movement a small, steady reminder of the weight he carried. His breath came faster now, each inhalation burning. He was not sure when the dizziness began, only that the trees seemed to sway, though there was no wind. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the uneven thud of his heart. The snow deepened near the bend, and as he pushed forward, his foot caught on a hidden branch. He stumbled, dropped to one knee, and for a moment stayed there, the world tilting. The sky above was a pale blur. When the blackness came, it was not sudden. It was like a slow curtain being drawn, the edges closing in until the center gave way. Tick. He woke to the hum of an engine and the smell of antiseptic. The ceiling above him was white, the kind of white that erased all sense of place. A warm hand rested on his forearm, steady and deliberate. "You're awake," Sarah's voice said. He turned his head slightly. She sat beside the bed, her coat draped over the chair, snow still melting from its edges. "I found your truck," she explained. "Figured you might have tried to walk. You weren't far, but you weren't in good shape." Rob's gaze shifted to the window. Beyond the glass, a city street stretched away, salted and plowed. Somewhere in this building, Michael was here. The thought steadied him more than the oxygen line under his nose. "Do you want to see him?" Sarah asked. He nodded once. The corridor smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. Sarah walked beside him, matching her pace to his slower steps. They passed rooms where voices murmured, machines beeped in quiet rhythm, and lives moved on in their fragile orbits. When they stopped, it was at a door with the blinds drawn halfway. Sarah stepped aside. Inside, the light was dim, the curtains pulled against the glare of afternoon. Michael lay in the bed, a thin blanket pulled to his chest. His hair was longer than Rob remembered, his face sharper, as though time had been carving it in his absence. For a long moment, neither moved. Rob stood near the foot of the bed, his hands resting lightly on the strap of the bag. Michael's eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the sight before them. Recognition flickered there, followed by something unreadable. They did not speak. The air between them was full, crowded with everything unsaid. Rob wanted to step closer to put the bag down and take the seed from its cloth to offer it as a small, fragile bridge, but his feet stayed rooted. Michael's gaze held his for a heartbeat longer, then drifted to the window. Rob followed the look and saw snow beginning again, flakes catching the light like brief, weightless sparks. Sarah lingered in the doorway, sensing the unspoken gravity of the moment. She did not fill the silence. Rob took one slow breath, then another. He thought of the years between them, the missed birthdays, the phone calls never made. He thought of Friday, and how quickly days could vanish. No words passed, but the meeting itself was something, a first step on a road still uncertain. That night, in the small hospital room they'd given him to rest, Rob sat by the window with the maple seed in his palm. Snowflakes swirled under the street lamp outside, each one unique and already melting on contact. He imagined planting the seed in this frozen earth, wondered if it would take root despite the cold. Perhaps some things didn't need perfect conditions to grow. Perhaps some things grew precisely because the conditions were hard. The thought stayed with him as he drifted toward sleep, the hum of the hospital like the low tide of a distant shore. The hospital at night was a different world. Corridors, dimmed voices, hushed footsteps softened to keep from waking the fragile. Machines still whispered and pulsed, but the frenetic pace of the day had dissolved into something slower, almost suspended. Rob sat in the visitor's chair beside the window of his small room. Snow pressed against the glass in restless flurries, then slid down in melting trails. He could see his reflection, faintly lined face, sunken eyes, shoulders drawn inward as though to hold in what little warmth remained. On the table beside him, the wooden box lay open, the maple seed resting in its cloth like a tiny relic. He had taken it out earlier, held it up to the street lamp light, then set it back. Some offerings needed the right moment. A soft knock came, and Sarah stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her. She carried something in her hand, a folded piece of paper worn at the creases. "I thought you should know," she said quietly. "I found this in your trash that day. Couldn't bring myself to throw it away. I fixed it." She placed it in his hand and stepped back. The paper was patched together with neat lines of tape, the ink slightly smudged where water or maybe a tear had touched it. Rob stared at the letter, his own words looking back at him. He remembered the moment he tore it apart, the conviction that it was better not to send it than to risk its rejection. "I gave it to Michael earlier," Sarah continued. "He didn't say much, just held it for a long time. Rob swallowed the sound loud in the quiet room. Michael's room was 3 doors down. The blinds were drawn and the light inside was low, casting a muted halo around the bed. He was propped against the pillows, the patched letter in his hands. His eyes moved slowly over the lines, pausing now and then, as if the ink carried more weight than the paper could hold. When Rob stepped into the doorway, Michael looked up. The silence that followed was not the heavy wall of before. It was something else, tentative, searching. I wrote that a while ago. Rob said, his voice low, uneven. Michael's thumb traced the edge of the tape holding the torn sections together. "Why'd you tear it up?" Rob hesitated, then let the truth come. "Because I thought you wouldn't want it. Wouldn't want me." Michael looked down again, eyes scanning the words I never stopped caring. Not for a day. He took a slow breath as though testing the air. "I thought you left because of me. Because I was broken." Rob stepped closer, the space between them narrowing to just a few feet. "You weren't broken. You were my son. You are my son. And if I wasn't there, it wasn't because I didn't want to be. It was because I couldn't be. The war took more from me than I understood at the time, and it didn't stop when I came home." Michael's gaze held his, and in that moment the years between them seemed both impossibly vast and strangely thin, like 2 ends of a rope finally being pulled taut. The clock on the wall marked the time in steady ticks. Outside, a siren wailed faintly and faded into the night. Michael set the letter on the bedside table, then reached for something from the drawer. It was a small object, paint chipped one wheel missing. Rob recognized it instantly, the toy truck he had given Michael on his 5th birthday, the one he thought had been lost years ago. "I kept it," Michael said simply. Rob's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, but the words caught somewhere between his chest and his mouth. They sat in the quiet, the kind that carried weight, but not hostility. Somewhere deep inside, the tightness Rob had been carrying for decades eased just enough to let breath move freely. Later, as visiting hours slipped toward their end, Michael spoke again. "They say the surgery is risky. I'm not scared of it. I'm scared of you not being here when I wake up." Rob leaned forward, resting his forearms on the edge of the bed. "I'll be here, no matter what." The truth was, his own body might fail before long, but that was not tonight's burden. Tonight was about something else, about showing his son that presence was possible, even after so much absence. Back in his own room, Rob placed the maple seed on the windowsill, letting the faint light from outside brush over it. He imagined planting it tomorrow or the day after the surgery with Michael beside him. The ground might still be hard, but some things were worth trying even in the wrong season. For the first time in years, he felt the faint outline of hope, not as a blinding light, but as a small, steady ember, warm against the cold. If you've carried someone's absence, or if you've learned to meet them again after years apart, you know these moments matter. Subscribe to our channel and walk with us to the final chapter of Rob's journey. That night, the hospital settled into its quiet rhythms. Snow kept falling beyond the glass, each flake a small reminder that even in the coldest seasons, the sky still found a way to give. And in a room down the hall, a letter lay patched together, its torn edges held fast not just by tape, but by the decision of 2 people to hold on to what remained. The morning of the surgery broke under a pale winter sky. Snow had stopped in the night, leaving a crisp white sheet across the hospital grounds. From his window, Rob could see the garden courtyard, its benches half buried, the pathways reduced to narrow channels where the maintenance crew had shoveled. He sat, dressed, waiting not for himself, but for the slow procession that would take his son from his room to the operating theater. His own body felt weaker than it had in days, the fatigue spreading deeper, but there was no mistaking the clarity in his mind. Today was about Michael. When the orderlies arrived, the hallway seemed to narrow. Rob walked alongside the rolling bed, one hand resting lightly on the metal railing. Michael glanced at him once no words exchanged, but in that glance was the silent agreement they had made he would be there when his son woke. The elevator doors opened with a chime, and the smell of antiseptic thickened. They paused outside the surgical wing. Rob stepped closer, leaning down just enough to be heard without raising his voice. "I'll be here," he said. Michael gave a faint nod. Then the doors swung shut, and the team moved him inside. The waiting room was nearly empty. A muted television in the corner cycled through news headlines no one seemed to watch. Rob settled into a chair near the window, the wooden box in his lap. His fingers traced the lid again and again, a slow, steady rhythm. Hours stretched. Outside, the sun drifted behind a thin layer of cloud, and the light took on a dull, silver hue. Rob's thoughts moved between memories. Michael's childhood laughter the first time he'd seen the boy run across the yard, the nights he'd stayed up listening for any change in his breathing. Those images carried warmth, but they also carried the weight of what had been missed. At one point, Sarah appeared beside him with 2 cups of coffee. She set one on the table without speaking, her presence a quiet anchor in the long span of waiting. It was late afternoon when the surgeon finally approached, mask pulled down, expression calm. "The procedure went as well as we could hope," he said. "He's in recovery now. You can see him once he's stable." Relief came not in a rush, but in a slow exhale, as though Rob had been holding his breath for decades, and only now remembered how to let it go. When he stepped into the recovery room, Michael was pale but breathing evenly, a soft monitor tone keeping time with his heartbeat. Rob took the chair at his side. His legs ached, but he barely noticed. For a long while, he simply sat there listening to the rise and fall of his son's breath. When Michael's eyes fluttered open, they found Rob immediately. "You're here," Michael said, his voice faint but steady. "I told you I would be." A small smile curved at the corner of Michael's mouth before sleep pulled him back under. The next day, with the winter sun low and golden, Rob asked Sarah for help to the courtyard. Michael, still weak but able to walk with a nurse's support, joined him. The cold wrapped around them as they stepped outside, but it was a clean cold, the kind that sharpened the air and stilled the noise. In the center of the courtyard, near a drift of snow, pushed to the side, a patch of dark soil had been cleared. Rob knelt slowly, the maple seed cupped in his palm. Michael crouched beside him. Neither spoke. Together they pressed the seed into the earth, covering it gently with soil and a thin crust of snow. The wind passed through the bare branches above, and for a moment it sounded almost like the rustle of leaves in summer. Rob sat back on his heels, his breath visible in the cold air. "It might not take," he said quietly. Michael looked at the small mound of earth. "Then we'll try again." Rob nodded, the weight in his chest lighter than he expected. In the days that followed, Rob's body reminded him of its limits. The walks were shorter, the rests longer. But the distance between him and his son had closed in ways that mattered more than any measure of strength. On their last afternoon together before Michael's discharge, they returned to the courtyard. Snow had begun to fall again, thin flakes settling over the spot where they had planted the seed. Michael stood with his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on that small hidden promise in the soil. Rob watched him, memorizing the angle of his shoulders, the way the light caught in his hair. There was a peace in the scene, fragile but real. That evening, back in his room, Rob opened the wooden box one last time. It was empty now, the cloth folded neatly inside. He closed the lid and set it aside. Through the window he could see the courtyard lamp casting a circle of light onto the snow. Somewhere under that white blanket a seed waited for spring. He thought of the years that had led here, the choices made, the silences kept the words finally spoken. The war had left its mark deep and lasting, but it had not erased everything. Some things, like the stubborn push of life toward the light, remained. If this story has reached you, if you've felt the weight of absence, the pull of reconciliation, subscribe to our channel. Walk with us through more journeys like Rob's where hope takes root even in the hardest seasons. The next morning, as dawn broke over the snow-covered courtyard, Rob sat by the window. His breath fogged the glass, and in that soft blur of light and shadow he imagined the seed beneath the snow. He knew he might never see it break the surface, but that no longer felt like loss. Planting it had been enough a gesture toward the future, toward growth beyond his own time. Somewhere in the stillness he felt it the quiet truth that even the longest shadows of the past could not keep a determined seed from reaching for the sun. And for the first time in years, Rob Callahan let himself believe in spring. The snow in the hospital courtyard had begun to melt, revealing the dark earth where a father and son had planted a single maple seed. Rob knew he might never see it grow, but that no longer felt like loss. Planting it was enough a promise to the future, a quiet act of hope. Some wounds never disappear. Some shadows never fully lift. But even in the hardest seasons, life will search for the light. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is take the first step toward it. If Rob's journey touched you, if you believe it's never too late to heal, subscribe to Han Trin Chualan. Here we keep telling the stories that remind us no matter the scars we carry, hope can still take root. The camera lingers one last time on the mound of snow-covered earth. A single stubborn stem pushes through a quiet green against the white. Fade to black.